Welcome back to Old State Valuable Coins. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of rare United States coinage as we explore four of the most valuable and expensive old quarter dollars that collectors are searching for. These coins may look like ordinary pocket change, but some can carry incredible history, rarity, and surprising value. So stay with us, because you won't want to miss which quarter could be the real treasure hiding in plain sight. Let's get started. First up to imagine holding a coin in your hand that was struck more than half a century ago. A coin that passed through American pockets, cash registers, grocery stores, banks, vending machines, and countless ordinary transactions during one of the most turbulent economic periods of the 20th century. This is the 1974 Washington quarter dollar, carrying the D Mint mark. A coin struck at the Denver Mint during a year when the United States was experiencing political uncertainty, rising prices, energy shortages, and a changing national mood. At first glance, this quarter may look familiar. It carries George Washington on the obverse and the familiar American eagle on the reverse, and millions upon millions were produced. But to understand what this coin really represents, we have to stop thinking of it simply as an old quarter and place it inside the America of 1974. This was a country trying to recover from years of social and political upheaval while simultaneously confronting an economic shock that affected nearly every household. The United States was dealing with the aftermath of the Vietnam era. The Watergate scandal was dominating national attention. Inflation was becoming a serious threat to household purchasing power, and the energy crisis had transformed the simple act of filling a car with gasoline into a national concern. In the middle of all this, the quarter remained one of the most practical pieces of American currency. It was money people actually used, not something created merely for collectors. A quarter could pay for a newspaper, contribute toward a meal, operate a machine, make change at a store, or become part of a child's pocket money. The 1974 D quarter therefore belongs to a fascinating moment in American history, because every example was born into a society experiencing enormous change. The D Mint mark tells us that this particular issue came from Denver, Colorado, one of the great production centers of American coinage. And while the individual coin in your hand cannot tell us the name of the person who first spent it, its date and mint mark connect it directly to the economic machinery of the United States in 1974. To understand why the 1974 D quarter was produced, we need to look at the monetary system and the enormous demand for everyday coinage. The Washington quarter had already been part of American life for decades. The design itself originated in the 1930s, when the United States prepared to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth. Sculptor John Flanagan created the familiar portrait, and the design eventually became a permanent circulating quarter rather than remaining a one-time commemorative issue. By 1974, Americans had become deeply accustomed to seeing Washington's face on the 25-cent piece. But the America receiving these quarters was very different from the America of the 1930s. The economy had expanded dramatically, the population had grown, wages and prices had risen, and the country had developed an enormous appetite for coins used in everyday commerce. The Denver Mint, therefore, had an important practical responsibility: produce enough quarters to keep commerce moving. There was no mystery behind the original purpose of the 1974 D quarter. It was made to function as money. It was not originally intended to be a scarce treasure. The United States Mint struck coins according to the needs of commerce, and quarters were particularly important because 25 cents represented a meaningful but convenient denomination for everyday purchases. In 1974, a quarter had considerably more purchasing power than it does today, making the denomination an important part of household spending. The coin was struck in the copper-nickel composition that had replaced the traditional silver composition for regular circulating quarters, beginning in the mid-1960s. This change was itself a reflection of economic reality. The rising market value of silver had made the old silver coinage increasingly expensive to produce and created concerns that the metal content could exceed the face value of the coin. The United States Mint therefore moved toward copper-nickel-clad coinage for regular quarters, dimes, and half dollars. When the 1974 D quarter emerged from Denver, it was consequently part of a new generation of American circulating money, designed not only to represent the nation, but also to survive the demands of a modern cash economy. And the circumstances surrounding its production become even more interesting when we examine the America of 1974. Richard Nixon was president, but his administration was under extraordinary pressure because of the Watergate scandal. The investigation into the break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters and the subsequent questions surrounding the Nixon administration had developed into a constitutional and political crisis. Americans were hearing daily about congressional investigations, recorded conversations, political accountability, and the possibility that the presidency itself could be fundamentally shaken. In August 1974, Nixon resigned from office, becoming the first American president to resign. Vice President Gerald Ford then assumed the presidency, promising to restore confidence in the government. This political drama unfolded while ordinary Americans were dealing with problems much closer to home. Inflation was cutting into purchasing power, and prices for food, transportation, and other necessities were climbing rapidly. The energy crisis that began in late 1973 continued to affect the country, following an oil embargo imposed by Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries in response to American support for Israel during the Arab-Israeli conflict. Gasoline shortages and long lines at filling stations became memorable symbols of the period. Americans were encouraged to conserve energy, speed limits were reduced nationally, and the idea that fuel could suddenly become scarce was a shocking departure from the assumption of abundant energy that had characterized much of the post-war period. Meanwhile, the country was still processing the consequences of the Vietnam conflict. In 1974, the United States was no longer conducting combat operations there on the scale seen earlier in the conflict, but the political and emotional consequences remained enormous. The nation was divided over foreign policy, government credibility, and America's role in the world. Against this backdrop, a $quarter might seem insignificant, but that is precisely what makes it historically valuable as an object of study. Coins are physical witnesses to ordinary life. The 1974 D-quarter was moving through American society while presidents changed, gasoline prices surged, inflation accelerated, and confidence in institutions was being questioned. It was part of the everyday financial bloodstream of the country. There is another important reason the 1974 D-quarter deserves attention: its relationship to the changing value of American money. In 1974, 25 cents was not merely symbolic. It could purchase substantially more than the same denomination can purchase today. People used quarters in ways that modern Americans might find surprisingly economical. A handful of coins could represent a meaningful amount of spending money, particularly for children, workers, and families managing tight budgets. The quarter appeared in parking meters, vending machines, laundromats, restaurants, stores, public transportation systems, and countless other settings. Because the coin was constantly circulating, many examples were handled thousands of times. Coins were dropped onto sidewalks, carried in denim pockets, stored in jars, mixed together in cash drawers, and exchanged repeatedly between strangers. Next up to take a close look at this 1973 Washington quarter with no mint mark, because what appears to be a missing letter is actually an important clue about how American coinage was produced during this era. Before we call this coin a rare error, there is a fascinating fact every collector should know. In 1973, the absence of a mint mark on a regular Washington quarter was completely normal. This coin was struck at the Philadelphia Mint, and Philadelphia did not place a P mint mark on circulating quarters during this period. So the blank space where a mint mark might be expected is not evidence that the mint accidentally forgot to add one. Instead, it tells us where the coin was made. That distinction is extremely important, because online claims sometimes describe an ordinary 1973 no mint mark quarter as a mysterious missing mint mark error. The genuine story is more interesting in a different way. This was a product of the American coinage system at a time when hundreds of millions of quarters were being manufactured for everyday commerce. The Philadelphia issue had a recorded mintage of 346,924,000 pieces, making it a large production run rather than a deliberately limited rarity. Yet within that enormous population, exceptional examples can still become difficult to locate, particularly coins that survived decades without significant contact marks or circulation wear. So as we examine this quarter, we are going to go inside the minting process itself, understand exactly how a normal 1973 quarter was made, see why the missing mint mark is normal, and then discover what genuine production mistakes could actually make a coin from this date valuable. The story begins with a blank piece of metal that collectors call a planchet. A planchet is not yet a coin. It is the prepared metal disc that will eventually receive the designs of the quarter. The 1973 Washington quarter was made from copper-nickel-clad material, consisting of outer layers containing copper and nickel bonded to a copper core. The finished coin weighed approximately 5.67 grams and measured about 24.30 millimeters across. Before a planchet ever reached the striking chamber, the metal had to be prepared, rolled to the proper thickness, cut into circular blanks, and processed so the edges could eventually take the familiar reeded appearance. These stages were designed for enormous production volumes. The mint was not manufacturing individual works of art one at a time. It was operating a highly organized industrial system capable of producing vast quantities of standardized currency. Once the blanks were prepared, they moved through additional processes before becoming finished coins. One particularly important stage was upsetting, in which the blank was transformed so that its edge could support the design during striking. The result was a prepared planchet ready to enter the coining press. This is where the distinction between a planchet, a die, and a hub becomes important. The planchet is the metal disc being struck. The dies are the hardened tools that actually contact the planchet and impress the coin's design. The hub, meanwhile, is part of the die-making process. Historically, a master hub was used to create working elements from which production dies could be made. In simple terms, you can think of the hub as helping transfer the intended design into the tooling system, while the finished dies are the components that ultimately strike the coins. By the time a 1973 quarter reached the press, an enormous amount of engineering and preparation had already taken place. Imagine now that the prepared planchet is sitting inside the striking press. Above it is one die, below it is another, and when the press operates, tremendous pressure forces the metal outward and into the recessed and raised portions of the dies. This single event transforms a plain metal disc into a recognizable Washington quarter. The obverse carries John Flanagan portrait of George Washington, while the reverse displays the American eagle surrounded by inscriptions and stars. The edge receives its reeded texture as part of the striking process. The strength and quality of the strike depend on numerous factors, including die condition, alignment, pressure, planchet quality, and the relationship between the dies and the planchet. If everything works properly, the result is an ordinary 1973 Philadelphia quarter. But if something goes wrong, the appearance of the coin can change dramatically. A planchet can enter the press incorrectly, a die can become damaged, a die can shift out of proper alignment, foreign material can interfere with the strike, or a planchet intended for one denomination can potentially become involved in an unusual production. Now let's address the feature that makes this particular 1973 quarter look mysterious: the complete absence of a mint mark. On a modern coin, collectors often expect to find a letter identifying the mint, so seeing nothing can immediately create the impression that something went wrong. But on a regular 1973 Washington quarter, there was no missing letter to begin with. Philadelphia struck circulating coins of this period normally carried no mint mark. PCGS specifically notes that Philadelphia coins from 1932 through 1979 bore no mint mark, with the P mint mark beginning on Philadelphia circulating coinage in 1980. That means the correct identification of a normal 1973 Philadelphia quarter is actually helped by the absence of a mint mark. Look at the obverse near Washington's hair ribbon, the area where mint marks were located for this era. You will not find a D or an S, and you should not expect to find a P. That blank area is exactly what you would normally see on a Philadelphia example. This is also why it is dangerous to compare the coin with a later quarter and assume the same rules applied. Mint mark practices changed over time. A collector who knows where a mint mark appears today can easily misunderstand an older coin if they do not know the historical production system. So if you have a 1973 quarter without a mint mark, do not immediately conclude that it is an error. The missing letter is not the rarity. The interesting question is whether the coin has some additional characteristic that can be traced to the minting process. That could include a genuine striking error, an unusual die problem, or extraordinary preservation. Without such evidence, the no mint mark feature is simply the normal Philadelphia identity of the coin. And this brings us to the most important question. Why do some 1973 Philadelphia quarters become much more desirable even though hundreds of millions were struck? The answer is condition. Think about what happened to these coins after they left the mint. They were designed to circulate, not to sit untouched inside protective holders. They could be transported in large bags, stacked with thousands of other quarters, loaded into banking equipment, dropped into vending machines, carried in pockets, placed in drawers, and exchanged repeatedly. Every contact could create a tiny mark. Even before a coin reached the public, contact with other freshly struck coins could leave abrasions or small surface disturbances. Over decades, circulation adds even more wear. That is why a heavily used 1973 quarter is common, while a truly pristine example is much harder to locate. PCGS currently estimates approximately 104,077,200 examples surviving in all grades, about 3,122,316 in grades of MS60 or better, and approximately 624,463 at MS65 or better. Those figures are estimates rather than a literal census of every coin in existence, but they demonstrate an important principle. The population becomes dramatically smaller as the grade rises. PCGS describes the issue as easy to obtain through about MS65, somewhat difficult in MS66, and very scarce in MS67, with few examples known at that level. That means the coin's greatest potential numismatic interest is not created by the missing mint mark, but by exceptional preservation. A viewer examining one should look for strong original luster, minimal contact marks, sharp design detail, and an absence of significant wear. The highest grades are determined by much more than whether a coin looks shiny to the naked eye. Professional graders examine surfaces, strike, luster, marks, and overall preservation under controlled conditions. A coin that appears perfect in a casual video can look very different under magnification and professional examination. Next up when you place a 1970 D Washington quarter under the camera, the first thing that may catch your eye is the familiar profile of George Washington, but this seemingly ordinary portrait carries an artistic history that reaches back more than a century before this particular coin was struck. The 1970 D quarter was produced at the Denver Mint, and the D mint mark identifies its place of manufacture, but the artistic identity of the coin comes from sculptor John Flanagan, whose Washington design had already been appearing on quarters since 1932. The coin measures about 24.30 millimeters across, weighs 5.67 grams, has a reeded edge, and by 1970 was made from copper-nickel clad over a copper core rather than the 90% silver composition used on earlier Washington quarters. The Denver Mint produced 417,341,364 examples dated 1970, which immediately tells us something important. The ordinary 1970 D quarter is not rare merely because of its date or mint mark. In fact, the survival estimates published by PCGS indicate that enormous numbers of the regular issue remain, with the series being considered common. What makes certain 1970 D quarters exciting is not the basic design alone, but the possibility of finding an unusually well-preserved example, a distinctive die variety, or a coin whose combination of sharp strike, surface quality, luster, and rarity within its grade separates it from the millions of ordinary pieces. To understand the artistry on this coin, we have to go back to John Flanagan himself. Flanagan was born in Newark, New Jersey, in 1865 and became a sculptor, medalist, and designer during an era when American sculpture was developing a strong national identity. He trained at Cooper Union in New York and, importantly, worked in the studio of the celebrated sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens during the 1880s. That experience placed Flanagan in direct contact with one of the most influential American sculptors of the period and helped expose him to the demanding world of monumental sculpture, portraiture, relief work, and medallic art. Flanagan eventually became known for sculptures and medals of his own, and his career included works connected with major public and commemorative projects. The Smithsonian American Art Museum records him as an artist born in 1865 and deceased in New York City in 1952, while describing his training and association with St. Gaudens. His artistic background, therefore, was not that of someone who simply happened to submit a drawing for a coin. He was a trained sculptor who understood how a three-dimensional portrait could be compressed into a small relief surface and still communicate character, authority, and recognizable likeness. That skill became especially important when the United States sought a new quarter design honoring George Washington for the 1932 bicentennial of Washington's birth. The Treasury ultimately selected Flanagan work for the circulating quarter, while another accomplished sculptor, Laura Garden Fraser, had also produced a highly regarded Washington design. The Mint itself notes that Fraser's proposed portrait was recommended for the quarter, but Treasury Secretary Andrew W. Mellon ultimately selected Flanagan's familiar left-facing portrait. Flanagan's greatest artistic influence on the Washington portrait came from an even earlier sculptor, the French neoclassical master Jean-Antoine Houdon. Houdon had created a famous bust of Washington after obtaining a life mask, giving later artists an unusually valuable physical reference for the first president's actual features. Flanagan adapted that tradition into a medallic portrait designed for a small circular field. Look closely at the obverse of the 1970 D quarter and notice how Washington's head is turned toward the left. The forehead rises prominently from the field, the nose projects in a strong, clean profile, the lips are defined but restrained, and the chin creates the lower contour of the portrait. His hair is rendered in sculptural masses and curls rather than as a flat silhouette, giving the portrait texture even though the entire image occupies only a small portion of the coin. Around that portrait is the word Liberty, sweeping across the upper portion of the coin, while I in God We Trust appears beside Washington's lower face and neck. At the bottom is the date 1970. Near the base of Washington's neck, look for the tiny initials JF, representing John Flanagan. Those initials are easy to overlook without magnification, but they are one of the most important artistic signatures on the coin. The portrait is not intended to look like a modern photographic image. It is a sculptural interpretation, built from simplified planes, contours, raised relief, and carefully controlled lines. The artistry lies partly in what Flanagan chose to emphasize and what he had to leave out. On a canvas, an artist can use thousands of subtle transitions of light and shadow. On a quarter, the sculptor has only millimeters of relief to communicate the identity of George Washington. Now turn the coin over, because the reverse reveals another major part of Flanagan's artistic vocabulary. The center is dominated by a powerful heraldic eagle with its wings spread widely across the field. The bird faces toward the left, and its body rests above a bundle of arrows. Beneath that bundle are two olive branches that curve outward and upward from the lower portion of the composition. Above the eagle is United States of America, and immediately beneath that upper inscription is the traditional motto, E Pluribus Unum. At the bottom is quarter dollar. On a Denver example from 1970, the D mint mark appears on the reverse beneath the eagle and between the stems of the olive branches. This placement is particularly important when examining the coin because it confirms the Denver origin and helps distinguish the piece from the Philadelphia issue, which did not carry a mint mark in this era. The composition is carefully balanced. The eagle creates a broad horizontal mass through its wings, the arrows provide a strong vertical and diagonal structure through the center, and the olive branches soften the lower portion with curved botanical forms. The imagery itself communicates two contrasting ideas. The arrows suggest military preparedness, while the olive branches traditionally represent peace. That combination gives the reverse a distinctly heraldic character rather than the appearance of a naturalistic wildlife portrait. When you rotate the coin beneath a light source, pay attention to the eagle's wing feathers, the central arrow bundle, the olive leaves, and the separation between the raised lettering and the surrounding fields. These details reveal how much information Flanagan attempted to fit into a very restricted circular space. The 1970 date is also fascinating because it belongs to an important transitional period in the physical appearance of the Washington quarter. By this time, the familiar Flanagan design had been transformed into a copper-nickel-clad coin. The change had occurred in 1965, when the United States Mint moved away from the traditional silver composition used on earlier Washington quarters. So when you examine a 1970 D piece, you are looking at an old artistic design being carried forward on a fundamentally different modern circulating material. The copper core can sometimes become visible along the edge when a coin has experienced heavy wear or damage, while a normal undamaged example shows the characteristic reeded edge. The surface should also be examined for the way light travels across the portrait and lettering. A high-grade example can display bright original luster moving around Washington's cheek, forehead, jawline, and the open fields. By contrast, a heavily circulated coin will show friction on the highest points of the portrait, flattening of the hair detail, softness in the eagle's feathers, and reduced definition in the finer lettering. This is where artistry and condition meet. Flanagan design was created with relief and texture in mind, but circulation gradually erases the very features that make the sculpture visible. Every time the coin passed through a pocket, cash register, vending machine, drawer, or handful of change, the raised portions were exposed to friction. The result is that collectors today are not merely judging whether the design is present. They are judging how completely the original sculptural work has survived. Next up to in the imagine holding a 1977 D Washington quarter in your hand and wondering where that little piece of metal has been for almost half a century. It may look like an ordinary 25-cent coin, something that could have passed through thousands of hands without anyone giving it a second thought. But every 1977 D quarter has its own physical journey, beginning at the Denver Mint and continuing through the hands of the people who received it, spent it, saved it, or simply placed it in a drawer and forgot about it. Unlike famous legendary coins whose individual ownership histories have been carefully documented through auction catalogs, private collections, and legal records, the ordinary 1977 D quarter does not have a single traceable chain of ownership. More than 256 million were struck at Denver, and today millions are believed to survive. That means we should not create a fictional story about one specific 1977 D being owned by a famous collector or disappearing for decades when the historical record does not establish such a story. Instead, the fascinating provenance of this coin begins with its creation as part of a huge production run in 1977 and continues through the countless individual journeys taken by surviving examples. Some were immediately released into commerce. Others were pulled from circulation because someone noticed their brilliant surfaces. Some were placed into jars, envelopes, albums, and family collections. And a tiny fraction survived with exceptional preservation, eventually entering the world of certified numismatics where their condition could make them dramatically more desirable than ordinary examples. That is the real mystery of the 1977 D. Not that only a handful were produced, but that after hundreds of millions were made, finding one in truly extraordinary condition became increasingly difficult. The first chapter in the coin's journey begins in Denver in 1977. At the time, the Washington quarter had already been circulating for decades, but the coin you are looking at belongs to the copper-nickel-clad era that began in the United States in 1965. Instead of the traditional silver composition used on earlier Washington quarters, the 1977 D quarter consists of a copper-nickel outer layer bonded to a pure copper center, with a total weight of approximately 5.67 grams and a diameter of about 24.30 millimeters. The Denver Mint struck 256,524,978 quarters bearing the D Mint mark, and each one entered the world as a product of a highly organized industrial process. Once struck, the coins were counted, handled, packaged, transported, and eventually distributed into the monetary system. From that point forward, their individual histories became almost impossible to reconstruct. A particular coin could have been carried in someone's pocket during a commute, placed into a vending machine, used at a grocery store, dropped into a cash drawer, saved by a child, or forgotten inside an old household container. Another example might have avoided circulation entirely because someone recognized its brilliant condition shortly after receiving it. The important point is that the mint created the coin, but the public created its provenance. Every subsequent owner became part of a chain that, in most cases, was never written down. This is why a normal 1977 D quarter cannot honestly be assigned a famous ownership history without documentary evidence. The vast majority of these coins simply traveled anonymously through everyday American commerce. Yet somewhere among those millions of ordinary journeys were coins that escaped the scratches, contact marks, friction, and environmental damage that normally accumulate during circulation. Those survivors became the foundation for today's high-grade examples. Now picture the moment when one of these quarters first left the Denver Mint and entered circulation. Fresh from production, it would have displayed the familiar portrait of George Washington created by sculptor John Flanagan, with liberty above the portrait, in God we trust alongside Washington, and the date 1977 below. On the reverse, the eagle spreads its wings over a bundle of arrows, surrounded by United States of America and E pluribus unum. with $quarter below and the D mint mark identifying Denver. At that moment, there was nothing to indicate which individual coin would eventually become collectible. The mint did not stamp a special ownership number onto each quarter. There was no certificate attached to it and no record stating that a particular example would one day become valuable. Every coin began with essentially the same opportunity. But once released, their paths began to separate. One quarter might have been heavily circulated for 20 years. Another could have been placed into a bank roll and remained untouched. Another might have been pulled from a cash register by a collector who noticed that it looked unusually fresh. This distinction is fundamental when discussing provenance. For a coin like a 1977 D quarter, the most meaningful historical story is often not a list of famous owners, but the evidence of preservation. A coin that survived for decades with nearly pristine surfaces has effectively escaped the normal history of pocket change. Its lack of wear becomes part of its story. Every unmarked field, every sharp design element, and every trace of original mint luster represents something that did not happen to the coin. It was not dragged repeatedly across rough surfaces. It was not badly dropped. It was not heavily rubbed against other coins, and it was not subjected to decades of careless handling. In that sense, the absence of damage becomes a form of provenance in itself. As the decades passed, some 1977, D quarters gradually disappeared from everyday commerce and entered collections. This is where the ownership history becomes more interesting, even though the names of most individual owners remain unknown. A collector could have purchased an uncirculated roll from a dealer, separated the best-looking coins, and placed them in an album. A family member might later inherit that collection. Years afterward, another collector might buy the group and submit the best pieces to a grading service. A coin that had spent decades sitting quietly inside a holder, envelope, or album could suddenly receive a professional grade and enter a completely different marketplace. Once certified, its history becomes easier to follow because the grading company assigns a certification number, and the coin can potentially appear in auction records or collection registries. PCGS even maintains individual set registry pages where owners can document coins in their collections and, in some cases, record purchase histories or previous ownership comments. For example, PCGS records individual 1977 D pieces in its registry, including an MS-68 example associated with the Tim Boyett/Kaleidoscope of Quarters collection. That is a genuine documented collector connection, but it should not be confused with a legendary chain of ownership stretching back to 1977. It simply demonstrates how a once anonymous quarter can eventually become part of a named modern collection. Another important lesson is that grading populations are not the same thing as the total number of coins surviving. A population report tells us about certified examples, while many additional coins remain raw or are certified by other grading companies. Consequently, when we ask how many 1977 D quarters exist today, there is no exact census. PCGS estimates approximately 89.8 million survivors across all grades and about 2.69 million surviving in MS-65 or better. Those figures are estimates rather than a literal count of every surviving coin. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn, because the ordinary 1977 D quarter becomes much more interesting when condition enters the picture. A collector looking at a circulated example may see a coin worth little more than its face value, while another collector examining a superb gem may see a completely different opportunity. PCGS describes the issue as common in most grades, with examples below MS-66 generally considered common. MS-66 is where the coin becomes somewhat scarce, and MS-67 is considerably more difficult to obtain.